This is Product by Design, a podcast by Prodigy, where we explore technology, artificial intelligence, user experience, product management, and the philosophy of building products and companies. All right, welcome back to another episode of Product by Design. I am Kyle, and this week we have another awesome guest with us, Ken Gavranovic. Ken, welcome to the show.
Kyle, first of all, awesome job with the name because, of course, that's an exciting one. Everybody has that. And just seeing your guitars in the background, that's one of my desires is one day to learn to play a guitar. That must be awesome.
It is, and I wish that there was more time for it. I feel like there's just not enough time, but I do feel like having them out and present makes it much more likely that we'll be able to like sit down and do that whenever there's a chance. That's why they're out, is so that they're not hidden away somewhere.
That's
But
great.
awesome. Well, Ken, let me give a brief introduction for you, and then you can tell us a little bit more about yourself. Ken is a global keynote speaker, a seasoned technology executive, and the CEO of Product Genius, where he leads the development of AI-powered tools that transform real-time data into actionable customer insights. And I'm excited to talk about all of those things and much more. But before we do that, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Cool. Well, I'll try to give you a short snippet and then we can dig into some things that might be relevant for the audience. I always like to start off with kind of like beginnings because I think it's interesting. We all come from beginnings, parents and relationship. And for me, it was, finances were always tough, just a kind of a not great childhood. But I didn't realize until much, much later that was one of my secret sauces to success because I think for many people, you see a lot of times first generation people that create really big business, a lot of value. Sometimes they had a tough childhood, and that's a motivator. So I always like to share that with anybody. If anybody thinks, "Oh man, I had the tough side of the ship growing up," hey, there's some good things that come out of that. For me, started beginning. I was like probably 13. Started reading these computer books back when you would read it. And, I was one of those really, I'm going to say computer nerd. I would go to the library and read and all this stuff. And where there was no internet, there was not anything, so it's like really the beginning. I remember my mom coming home and I had programmed assembly and there's like 6 guys that look like from ZZ Top that programmed the chemical refinery. So lots of those experiences. But what always got me excited is the idea with technology. Actually, I saw the movie War Games, funny enough, not the war part, but the idea that this kid could sit in his house and like change the world got me excited about technology. And my passion, what I thought was great about technology, you could listen to a problem, right? And the product part. What is the problem? Like, how are we going to design something to solve it? And in my case, when I was younger, I was the product person, the engineering person, so I could put it all together. And I was 19 when I built my first couple $1 million software product. So I've been very blessed to do that. And we'll dig into some of those things that might be relevant for journeys maybe that people are thinking about, whether it be startup to IPO or scaling, unicorns. I've got some great stories we can share.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to hear some of those stories. I think they'll be great. Before we do that, what things do you like to do outside of the office or outside of work?
I love nature and nature adventures. So I would say I've been blessed that financially has given me some ability to travel. So, whether it be taking the kids to the Galapagos Islands, and literally being in the ocean and grabbing seaweed and throwing it, and the dolphin goes and grabs it like a dog and brings it back to me. Like, so traveling, hiking, we've given that to our kids. We've taken them on RV trips. But I would say, really outside of work, it's probably family and travel and adventure is probably my big things. And I say adventure like I've done things like flying a MiG fighter jet and jump out of planes, so different versions of adventure.
Wow. Do you have a favorite place to travel that you've been so far or that you would want to go to?
That's a great question. So I would say from a chill perspective, I always like Key West. I actually just took my daughter, it's graduating soon. We're in Key West this past weekend. Another place I think is just beautiful, Sedona. If you haven't been there, amazing, amazing place. If you're just gonna like check the box, like weird kind of things in this world, if you can do it, I would say the 2 things I probably would think were the most interesting was the Northern Lights, like seeing that with your own eyes, simply stunning. The Galapagos Island, and I'll put one more most beautiful place, Banff, Canada. If you've ever been there, stunning. Like if you ever see like your Windows screensaver, if you have one of the windows where it has the blue water, like that is Banff. Check it out. It's a great place to go.
Wow. Okay. We'll have to put that on the list. That does sound incredible. Awesome. Well, I'm excited to dive into some of the things that you mentioned. Maybe you can kick us off by telling us just a little bit more about your journey. You kind of started with, the fundamentals or foundations of where you got started, but you've done a lot of things. So maybe give us the high level overview of what you've done and how you ended up where you are right now.
Cool. I'll hit on some of them. Maybe we'll slow down where I think there's probably some really relevant product lessons. So, as I mentioned before, I started off writing software, but I was the product guy. Going back to Vision when I was a wee young lad, I was walking down the hallway, had my coffee at my job, and I saw this big line of people. And I'm going to date myself, but again, this was like 17, and this big line of people all drinking coffee, and they were standing in this thing for back in the day. They called this thing a fax machine, and I looked at it, and what went in my head is, wow, that's totally inefficient. And so I went to the owner of the business and I said, I could write something where we could push a button, everybody can fax from their desk. So I did that. Next year, we sold $2 million worth. The downside is going back to my childhood, I didn't know I should ask for a percentage of that business. So I proceeded in my 20s to make millions, then tens of millions for other people with my ability to understand a business problem and then put either engineering resources, product design to make that happen. I'll fast forward to my 26, 27. I grew up in Texas. I've lived in New York. I always say New York's a great place to like learn business skills because if not, you get taken advantage of. And I did get taken advantage of. But fast forward down to Florida, I kind of had my business feed on myself. And this thing called the internet was starting. This is back when AOL was there. It was like, so I was probably like 26. And I was like, wow, this is fantastic. Every business is going to run their business on the internet. And back then, South Florida only had a 45 meg connection. So we think about it like I've got a gig to my house, 45 meg connection to everything in South Florida. And so I said, wow, this isn't going to work. And I looked at the cheapest place to live with the highest density of backbone, dark fiber, and moved to Atlanta, which is still where I live in the outskirts of Atlanta right now. Took all of my savings, rented half of a floor, and started a company that became web.com. Took it from 0 to 200 million IPO, all the fun stuff, all the challenging stuff, 0 to 600 employees when I was 28. And again, but it all started with product. The first person I hired, in that case, I was no longer going to code because I was doing the product piece, is I hired an engineer. And I said, great. Well, one of the things that I'm going to do, if I'm going to have thousands and thousands of servers, I've got to write some software so that I can quickly provision, automate, and do all those things. And it's just kind of sad, but for years, we actually had a patent on automating and provisioning because we built really, really great software. Microsoft licensed it. And later, after we merged the company, it became web.com. You may have heard of it. That company went around with my license and started suing everybody for automation. Not something I would have done, but I remember one time I met Bob Parsons at GoDaddy and we were at some conference or whatever. And I was like, hey, I'm web.com, and he's like, you guys sued me, no, no, no. I'm like, oh, it wasn't me, man. So anyways, adventures and those things. But again, great example of right time. So you think about product, if the momentum has to be with you, like if you're fighting upstream and no one wants to buy it, no one understands the problem you're solving, you could build really great product, but that's tough. And then, going back to what's the biggest problem I need to solve? Because in some cases you might be doing product internally for your company. I think with AI, you're going to see a lot of how do we automate parts of our business that are very manual right now, a lot of internal product work. So that was kind of the early stages, and then I can dive in more from there. But that kind of give you the kickoff to the career. Obviously going through an IPO as a 20-something-year-old, usually you get pushed out. Staying there post IPO and all that experience was great and set me up for the things that I did later.
I think that's fascinating. And there's a couple things I want to kind of dive into a little bit there. Tell us more about first off the founding and running of a company. What were some of the things that you found out during maybe those early stages or you found out since that really drive a lot of the success in creating something new, especially a new company and building it up to where it was?
Yeah, well, I would say like even because I've done angel investing, I think anything a new company is luck, skill, and timing, right? So you could call it luck, if I'm a spiritual guy, whatever you want to call it, but those three things have to come there. So, when I think about the things that I've seen is if you get in the right space at the right time and then have the skills to take advantage of it. That's, I think, when you can build a big business. I think as a skill for an entrepreneur or a product person, because maybe what you're doing hasn't been done yet, you need to have conviction, right? If you're someone that can't make decisions and it's decision by committee, you need to listen to everybody, but you're going to have to make some bold decisions, and you're going to have great things that are going amazing, and then you're going to have this thing that's going to fall off. It's not a steady state. So not everybody's built for that, to really listen to it. And then I'd say finally, this is consistent. And I've worked with multiple people that are billionaires that have built businesses. I built a great business to 400 or 500 million, but people have built it to multi-billions. And there's a key thing is a real passion for the customer and a real curiosity on what are the real problems that I'm solving for the customer, and how will I know that I'm successful? And that's one of the things, like, how do I know I'm successful? Because I see a lot of times, and even product people that have worked for me, success is check the box, I ship something, or even engineering. Success is I ship the box. And then you've seen that. You've seen projects that have gone on 6 months, 9 months, and they launch it, and then it quote fails. But if you go back, they usually didn't have a good definition of success to start with. Hopefully I answer your question.
Yeah, I think that's great. And that's one of the things that I see frequently as well is this idea that success is measured in feature releases or the launch of something as opposed to addressing whatever the problem is or the need is. So I'm interested, how have you helped either change some of that mindset or in the companies you've been involved in, either building or involved in as an angel investor or from the outside? How do you address that problem that this something isn't just about releasing a feature or releasing a product, it's about solving a problem and then the metrics behind that for the business and for the customer?
Good. So I'll hit on two, I think, pretty things. One, Cox. Maybe you've heard of Auto Trader, Kelly Blue Book, all of those things. And then I'll do another one, which was New Relic, which it was the mini. We went from like 300 to 600 million. So really that kind of hyper stage, already public, all that kind of good stuff. So when I went into Cox, this is in the, I'll call it the digital transformation. So, and a lot of times people were defining digital transformation as we go to the cloud, which is a terrible definition of digital transformation. Or digital transformation is, we're quote agile versus water drill, or whatever it may be. I think all of those things are a little bit, questionable to me. But when I went into Cox, it was the biggest business unit. So this is something we put $100 billion a year. And what this is when you go, it's a company called Manheim. And when you trade in your car, they actually take it to an auction, and that really defines what's the wholesale rate for car as a whole thing. And again, I've done many different industries, but I didn't, all right, I could figure out any industry, and I've been able to. So anyways, with that, they built a lot of software, and a lot of times that software didn't work consistently, and they didn't know. So there would be like one out of 5,000 customers that had a horrible experience. And hopefully that wasn't a big customer, because then that was a big problem. And so this goes back to tooling first. So the first thing I did is I said, okay, we had no visibility. We had no visibility of this is good or bad. And again, you'll see the New Relic tie in a little bit. So the concept observability, which I actually launched that when I was at New Relic, let's call this observability. But we started investing in tools that allow the product managers and the engineering leaders to understand with dashboards the quality and the consistency of the products that they were delivering. And that was a big changer. And I think most companies have kind of realized that. I think that's kind of like table stakes at this point. But at the time, that was something new, is really getting people to focus. And the other part is getting the product team and the engineering team out in the field talking to customers. You've seen this time and time again where there's somebody and it's just an echo loop. I'm so busy launching the next feature, fighting off the sales team, all of those type of things, into really getting focused. Guys, what are we, ladies, what are we doing, and how is it important? So I would say during that time, like I brought Andy Jassy in. I said, hey, we can't wait 3 weeks for a server. Like that's crazy. And they had VBlock and all of but the public cloud's much faster. Changing that. Same thing is everybody was afraid. Customer advisory board, or sometimes a release board. You've seen that sometimes the product person has to present, what is this thing, and can we release it, and is it safe? Just friction. Like, so I destroyed all of that, automated all of that at a big company, which was scary for people. and really get people that we need to release fast. It's okay if we fail. If we have good instrumentation, we'll know that we failed and we can roll back very quickly. And that goes, of course, to the automation, which then allows product managers to have a lot more flexibility. And I think the next story I'll dig into with New Relic really is going to be, I think, specifically to some of the challenges I think many product managers.
Awesome. Well, yeah, would love to hear that story because I think you've touched on a couple of points that are just so critical in my mind. The idea of being connected to the customer. So getting out of the office and out of just the work so that you know you're doing the solving the problems right. And then being able to observe and then also just rapidly changing. So once you have the insights, the observability, you can move much more confidently than if you were just kind of launching features based on what an executive said like we need to launch. So would love to hear how that played out at New Relic as well.
Yeah, well, I think that's interesting. So I met Jim Goshi at when I was at Cox because I had a $250 million budget. So I was doing transformation, not just at Manheim, but at all business units and redoing how we operated, going to the cloud, changing how we thought about success. I call it outcomes over activities. And so introducing all of those kind of concepts. And so I met Jim and he said, "Hey, listen, we're really having a lot of success in enterprise, but we don't know how to sell enterprise like you've been living it, you've been transforming it." And for those of us that haven't done transformation at big enterprises that have been around 75 years, it's a little hard, right? You have a lot of people issues, it's what people process, and technology is the easiest part of any type of transformation. Everybody thinks it's tech. No, no, people process, that's the hard part. I had left Cox and was going to take a little time, see what I want to do next. And Jim reached out. He said, "Hey, would you like to come to New Relic?" And I said, "Okay, well, what do you guys want me to do?" And they go, "Well, we need somebody that could talk to our customers. So we want you to do all the keynotes, all the public speaking, and like go out and meet with customers." And I was like, "Oh, this is great. Normally I have like 500 employees. How many people have report to me?" Like, "No, you could just do it yourself." I'm like, "This is the best thing ever. Are you kidding me?" So, I started flying around and I took over for the CEO doing all the customer keynotes globally, do all the big customer meetings. It was great because I've been a big customer. I was very, very effective in it. But I also started noticing all of the gaps in the product. And I started hearing that we hadn't New Relic hadn't released at the velocity that it used to. And of course, I'm embedded right in all of that. And I would write these little reports that would go to the leadership team. And so one day, having a great time, I get a call from the CEO of the company. He's like, "Hey, I really like your notes and all those kind of things. Can you just come do that in product?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, I can." And I was thinking to myself, all right, here I go, another transformation thing. But, I really like the company and a great CEO and Jim. So came there, but it was tough because like I'm in Atlanta, right? And I've been working in New York companies and, basically traveling because my wife said you can't move. And this is on the West Coast. And so I'm like flying to the West Coast and flying all over the country. And where I started landing was the firing of the product manager that was the product leader. And so we had 700 people. So suddenly 700 people reporting to me with product and engineering, and we hadn't delivered much in 3 years. And so when I landed, kind of analyzing what happened was kind of the first step. And of course, there, West Coast, some guy from the East Coast, it was a lot of fun stuff. And then if you want, I could just dig into kind of because what I'm about to say next, because I've done a lot of advising, see time and time again in all different companies. So it's a pretty common pattern, and I'll dig right in. But I don't know if you had any questions first.
Yeah, I would love to dig into that and understand the specifics of that. And then we can maybe step it back out to some of the general questions. But, tell us more about what that process was like. And especially around, like you mentioned, not just the technology change, but the cultural and people and
Yeah, people
process
process. Yeah.
changes.
So what you see very common is silos, right? So you see this like some companies have gone and created a CPTO where product and engineering reports into the same person. Sometimes you haven't, but what typically happens is you have product, and product's got its own vision, and then oftentimes there's a lot of pressure from the sales team to do feature X, Y, or Z quickly so that they can close X, Y, or Z deal. So you've kind of got, I'll call it product vision in conflict with sales vision to close the deal tomorrow, right? Then you've got engineering that wonders why product keeps changing its mind. Now, meanwhile, we know that's because that's that friction, that balance between that. And then you might have a CEO that's a visionary in himself, and I won't say specific to because Lou, great guy, but I'll just say I've been in companies where like the CEO will loop in and override product and engineering team. So suddenly the product has been working on this, and suddenly the CEO, oh, I've got this great vision. And by the way, he had some great visions. That's how you built a multi-billion-dollar business. So you like you want to discount those things. But when you have all of those things, you've got maybe the CEO, or they have this idea, the sales team's got this idea, product's got this idea. Engineering's like, no, we don't need any of those things. Often they have their own idea. Plus they wonder why everybody else keeps changing their mind, because as you know, when engineering, gets flipped around, it's a very expensive thing. And so that was kind of the situation that I saw myself. We hadn't delivered much. We had done a big deal with IBM that required a complete rewrite to do some things from a GDPR perspective. And so a lot of different things. And so I'll just share with the process. And the CEO and I were aligned is that we wanted to move to a general manager model. And I'm sure you've seen that. It's pretty popular these days. So get somebody that's in a pod federated over the product and engineering, over a part of this thing, but that has some accountability to numbers, not just shipping, not just features and those things. And so kind of steps that I take, and I think this is a pretty common playbook if you could do it, is first go back with the say, guys, listen, we haven't delivered much in 3 years. Let's be honest. Okay. Got it. If we keep doing what we're doing, which is whatever you ask us to do at the last minute and we shift to it, we're also not going to deliver what our customers want, because we have to close our new deals, but we've got to take care of our customers, especially if you've got a product that grows. So I've got kind of the sales team aligned. Here's what we think the most important things are. Got the product team. Here's what they think is the most important thing. Got the engineering to understand why that was the most important thing, and then did that restructuring into general manager models into the various groups. So that kind of helped people. So now we've got this alignment. And then I'm going to say this is probably a little bit tough, but what we said is we're going to give the product and engineering team 20% flexibility. So if anything new comes in that's not on the roadmap, that's not our quarterly plan, went to quarterly planning, then as long as you could do it in your 20%, you don't need to escalate that. You can make the decision at the lowest levels of that organization. So you can be very responsive, but to an extent, 20% of your capacity. And then we said anything that impacts the roadmap, you no longer had permissions to change it. So that way we weren't, I would call it purposeful trade-offs. We no longer made trade-offs without really understanding what it was. And we set up a cross-functional group. So anytime, and this also gave the product team coverage. So when someone would come to them and say, hey, I need this to close this $10 million deal, they could say, hey, I'm sorry, that's going to go over my flex capacity. You have to go to this meeting. And that meeting had somebody higher up from sales, from product and engineering, myself, me and the CEO. And so then we would have a business conversation. What are the trade-offs of doing this thing versus what our plan was? And at first, it was a lot of friction, but after a little bit, became great. And we actually delivered more in the first 8 months in the company, according to like Disney, according to Capital One. We had really big customers than they had in years because of that very simple structure. And then there's a couple of details I want to go into with product, going back to, what is shipping success?
Yeah, well, I'm interested in plus one. Were there any specific difficulties in kind of that cultural change? Because I know it can happen with many people can be on board, or they can mentally be on board, but like when it actually starts to hit, I can no longer, if I'm a salesperson, I can no longer just kind of interrupt the roadmap. Like, how did you overcome some of those difficulties, and especially initially, until you started to see the success? And then would love to hear some of the product specific things that go along with that as well.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of the Kubler curve? Yeah. So, if you look at it, there's this graph and it has a bunch of words, but I'll just say is that typically there's kind of like, we've heard this before, we've tried this before, we don't believe this, productivity goes down. Assuming you're actually successful, they start to see it, productivity goes up. And so your goal whenever you're a transformational leader is to minimize that depth. Now, what I shared with you, I was probably able to be more successful, because I was reporting to the CEO. So that, of course, gave me political firepower. I already had a great relationship with the sales team, high trust, and I had done everybody's role. I'd led engineering teams, I've led product, I've led go-to-market sales. And so I think that, that probably helped me with the powers. I think for a lot of times when you're a product leader, navigating those things that, product sometimes is a pretty tough, this political situation to be in a company. You've got a lot of competing interests for a limited set of resources, right? You've got your existing customers, you've got all those things. And so there was certainly a lot of challenges. So the first thing with the product team is to really reiterate, we are going to do this. This is going to happen with confidence, and then follow it up with execution. Show people that we're doing things differently. And once they start to see it, and that goes back to transparency. So I had regular meetings. Here's what we're doing. Here's why we're doing it. Here's the steps. So lots of weekly reports, lots of transparency, I think is probably one of the key things that you have to do in getting everybody aligned. And then I think, to me, I've done this now from a consulting advisor for a number of private equity companies. And so far, every single time it's worked, I think giving a certain level of flexibility to make decisions at a low level, because sometimes that's held too high. So a certain level of capacity go there. And then the other part, really a lot more hurdles to change it. And then instead of it being like the product leader just says, no, we're not going to do that, because then they're going to get overwritten because the salesperson, it's this thing, it's the quarter. So having a cross-functional at the top leadership, what that does is it forces everybody lower in the organization to say, is this something that I want to go make an argument in front of the head of sales, in front of the head of product, in front, instead of the leaders. And I think that's one key part I think that probably helps. So credibility, or if you don't have that credibility, building that credibility cross-functionally, getting people aligned, and then having structurally a process so that when there is friction, the friction hires happens in a point. And we had a meeting, and we would say, we're going to make a decision in this meeting. So either you're there or you're not, but it's not going to drag, because that's the other part that hurts people is people don't make decisions. That friction exists lower, often with product team, with other people they're fighting. And then it just makes people spin. And that's where you see like engineering velocity goes terribly, because the product person might have been pushing really hard and they got overwritten by their boss or somebody else.
Yeah.
I'm
I
sure you've
think
heard that many times.
Yeah, heard and seen numerous times. So I love that idea of, having the transparency, like you said, the credibility to do some of those things, the transparency where everybody can understand what we're doing, and then the almost like a forced prioritization. I think that that's such a critical thing, because I think most people want all the things, and it's difficult to make trade-offs. And so how are we systematically going to make those trade-offs? Is this thing worth more than these other things that we already determined were the highest priority? And if so, then we have to make a decision and understand it's going to have costs associated with it. We can't just put everything in and expect everything to get done. There's the trade-off and then the costs associated with that as well.
I agree. And I think I didn't really emphasize much, but I put a pretty structured quarterly planning process. So I am a fan of a quarterly plan. Does that mean you're going to lock and load no matter what? And going back to, you could dial up the flexibility. Like I said, you could say give 40% flexibility and 60% is quote fixed and has this higher override. But what I've seen, a lot of people don't have anything. And so then it's just constant feature factory. And it's really, really hard to execute a coherent strategy in the marketplace when you're just constantly reacting. So I'm a big believer that you should have a quarterly plan. You should have that, but you can dial up like how much is that fixed capacity that has a lot more constraints on changing it, and then that flex capacity.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's great. I'm interested too. You mentioned, some of the product side of that as well. So how did you go about implementing some of these things down at the product level, and were there hurdles there initially to overcome, and what were some of the ways that you were able to actually reach that we're actually delivering and executing on these things that we said we were going to?
Yeah, great question. So I'd say, first of all, it was a little challenging because we actually had people that would fly in. We did Agile very, very well. We had 70 different teams. We released literally hundreds of times straight to production, had full rollback. So, you think about the dream nirvana, we kind of were already there, but where it lacked was, again, is what is that success, and let's lock and load. Why are we doing it? And so one of the things that I'm a big fan of is, when you think about, I'm going to build something, is why. Okay. And I always like to instead of talking about generically, I always like to go to a real life scenario. So one of the things I would say is, when you built your quarterly plan, and this is also about the quarterly plan, you could say, I want to do this, and here's why we think it's good. But I would say, okay, and how do we know that's going to be successful? And so this is a true life story. Somebody had come into my office, and at that point, we had built software that sat on servers and sent this data that told us that the server was working well. And increasingly, customers were engaging in Kubernetes and different types of open source tools, and they wanted to send that data too. So they didn't want, there was no agent. And at that point, we didn't have an agentless approach. And so the great product manager for that team, as the general manager actually, came to me and said, "Hey, the team wants to build this, and the customers have been asking for it." And great, makes a lot of sense. I'm pretty aligned. Okay, so what is success? And they said, "Well, we're going to deliver it by, then this quarterly plan." And I said, "Well, that really doesn't work for me." And they go, "What do you mean?" I said, "So if we deliver it, how will we know that we were successful?" And they said, "Well, we're going to generate some revenue." I said, "Okay, revenue, that's great. So how much revenue are we going to? Well, I don't know. It depends on how many." I said, "Great. So how many transactions are we going to? They'll kind of like those five whys. How many transactions are we going to do? Well, we're going to do these many transactions." And I said, "Okay, so would that be success?" And I could see their eyes light up. They go, "Well, let me get back to you. We're going to go review our plan and come back to you." And I said, they came back to me and they said, "Well, yeah, we think we looked at it, and with the demand, we think," I'm making this number up, I don't remember right now, "we think that we could do 1 million API calls in the first 30 days and da da da." I said, "Okay, great. So I just want to be clear is what you're committing to me and the company is you're going to deliver and have customers deliver 1 million of those in whatever 60 days." And they looked at me and they go, but then I'm going to have, but hold on, I got to do sales training and I got to, yeah. And so, it was cool because I saw like their eyes opening up. And so then they came back to me and then they thought through a more detailed plan. Okay, well, we need to build it at this date, and then we need to train the sales team, and then we need to make the SKU, and then we need to talk to the accounting team to make it something that they can actually put on the order form and all of these different things. And they said, but we got a problem. And I said, yeah. And they said, well, we looked at it and we think that 80% of our volume is going to be from Kubernetes, and we were just going to give people an API. And I said, okay, well, how are you going to get the million? Well, no, we couldn't do that unless we built some sort of light wrapper that made it very easy for people to send us that data in Kubernetes. And I said, okay, so that's another thing that you have to do. So what you just learned from having that target of 1 million, all of the things you had to do in pre-sales, all of the extra features beyond this core API, wrappers for Kubernetes, likely candidates that you also had to build. But if I hadn't asked that question, none of that would have been done. It would have been the other, and you've seen this many times, where someone rushes to build something, they launch it, the sales team doesn't know how to sell it, it's not there. They hadn't coordinated with the other team that puts it as a SKU, and then it's confusing how the package was rolled out. By getting people to focus on success and say, "I'm going to measure you and the team on what you came up. I didn't come up with it. That success." You drive incredible behaviors throughout the organization. That's where I always say outcomes over activity. And so that's kind of like, so when we would do the quarterly plan, it would have in there the success was they're going to do 1 million by this date. And I would always frame it as a goal versus a commitment. I'll just share this one of my other product things I always say. So a goal is I'm going to do my best, or the team's going to do their best to get there. A commitment is I'm going to do it even if it isn't in the company's vested interest to hit what I said I'm going to do then. Because sometimes maybe you got a contractual commitment or legal things. Sometimes you have to make a commitment. But I always like to make it very, very clear what you lose in making a commitment is I'm going to have less flexibility because I'm going to say, no, I'm not going to do that. You're going to say, but Ken, that makes a ton of sense to do it. We need to close. Great, it does, but I made a commitment. So I lost that flexibility. And when you do that, that really helps people feel comfortable. And using that terminology, because some people get nervous, like 1 million goal. That's your goal, which means you're going to do your best to get there. I said a lot there. Hopefully, I give you a few thoughts.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the differentiation between the goal and the commitment, because most of what we're trying to do is some of those targets. But there are times when we have to actually commit to either certain numbers or certain dates, but making that more of an exception or a very well thought out thing that if we make a commitment here, this becomes very inflexible, like you said. This
Right,
is something that,
constraints.
yeah, we're now doing, and everybody needs to understand that, as opposed to here's our goal for these metrics. We think by doing this, it will, drive 1 million API calls or 1 million signups or whatever the number is. And here's all the things that we're going to do, not just to release the product, which I think so many people get hung up on. Like if we just release it, that's the thing. But no, there's the training, there's the business process, there's all the things that have to happen in order to make it a success and reach that goal or reach those success metrics, because otherwise it's just another feature that people are cranking out.
I agree. And I think from an organizational design, I always say, listen, if you set the right goals, you'll drive the right behaviors. And so if you think about it, how many people we're going to have project meetings and this, that, and the other to get all those other things that need to be done. But if you set the right goal, it's a forcing function to make sure all of those things happen.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right because it then goes beyond just a product and engineering thing, and it's now an entire business goal. Like you said, general manager style that we have to get everybody involved in order to reach this. Otherwise, it won't be successful. Like you could ship a feature, but it won't hit any of the business goals that you have in mind.
I agree. And I think one thing is I'll just go back to the goal versus commitment because I'm sure you've seen this. And I think it's a challenge. I've seen a lot of companies, maybe they're fast growing to a certain page and it works at a certain point, but it doesn't scale where they say, oh, we're agile. We don't do goals or commitments. We just go as fast as we can. And this is my opinion. I know some people feel different. I just don't think that works at scale. I've never actually seen that work at scale anywhere. It works when you're building it, when everything's in a line. But once you start getting some competition or you get a bigger customer base, you have to have a plan, you have to have business metrics, and you have to have that differentiation. Now, I think, again, where a lot of people get hung up is that definition. So if anybody's listening out there, and I wrote a bit on transformation business breakthrough 3.0. I hit on this, but I think that really articulating to everybody is we're going to make goals and we're going to make commitments. And they're two different things. And not just to the product team, but to all of your partners, your sales team, if you have a project management team, to be really clear about terminology, because that has a huge, huge impact around people, how they operate. And when you, especially, particularly around that constraint conversation, it makes sense. Like usually if you could go to a sales leader and you say, listen, I'll make commitments all day long, but let me just make sure what that means is I can't be flexible. If you want me to deliver on all my commitments, I'm going to commit less because I'm always going to run into things that are unknown. I'm going to have some engineering thing. There's going to be some bug. There's going to be some distractions. And so the more you want me to commit, the less flexibility, the less risk I could take. On a goal perspective, I can take lots of risks because I'm going to do my best.
Yeah, totally agree. And agree with you on the scale that having worked with very, very small companies to very large ones, like when you reach a certain point and size of company, the things that were working for very, very small just no longer work. It would be great if they did, but you have to have more of that structure and framework in place in order to be successful as far as like what the plan is, what are the metrics, all of those things, because you just you don't have as much flexibility as you do when you're at a very, very small startup, early stage company, that type of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's going to get even tougher with AI because, and I don't know if this is a good part to transfer, but I think AI is going to give us insights into how our customers are using our product, what they really think, what they really want, and then making sure that you can react to that. Because again, if you don't, it's a big issue. So, like I do sometimes advising for private equity and some venture capital and so forth. And like right now, what's happening from an engineering side, what used to take $20 million and let's call it 20 engineers now costs $1 million and 4 engineers. So, if you've got somebody that's got a really clear product vision, and so what you're seeing is there's companies that haven't innovated in a long time, and now there's people that basically almost like copying their business model, but they can build it faster and cheaper than ever before. So I think this AI component and how it's going to impact engineering and product, I think is going to be really, really impactful. It's ultimately great for consumers, but that efficiency curve as it comes up to speed is going to be scary for all of us.
Yeah, I'd love to touch on more of that. Where are you seeing AI playing a role right now, especially in product and engineering? And how do you see that changing the way that we are creating not just the products and experiences, but also businesses in general?
Yeah. Well, I've been doing AI for 7 years, which when I say this to people, they think, wait, it's only been around for 2.5. No, that's ChatGPT, right? But AI's been around for a long time. So, like for example, at New Relic, New Relic had all this instrumentation, all this metadata from mobile apps and this and that. And so, what's the challenge? It's one thing when everything falls over and it's just hard down. But as you move to microservices architecture, it's a little bit more complex. And so we rolled out called New Relic AI, where we took and we built anomaly detection. So we took all of the metadata, all time series aligned, and started using AI to look for anomalies, which then allow people to set thresholds for anomalies. And so now you're detecting things before even customers knew about it. So that was kind of a thing that I did. I was in another company called Blameless, that we had the software. So like when Ticketmaster have an outage, there's a lot they have to coordinate with. And so you've got people, you've got product, engineering, lots of people on the calls and so forth. And so we had the software that people would use to facilitate, both fixing and then after what happened. But we built some AI. So we looked at, like, for example, the Slack channels, because when you've been in an outage, right? Something weird happens, somebody release it. And so it's a lot of time getting everybody up to speed. So great example for AI, because again, it could take all of that unstructured data and uncover the pattern. So we were able to basically take the hours of outage information and say, okay, here's what's happened. Here's what people have tried. Here's the players on the call. And so people would get up to speed, faster. And then, the company I'm involved with right now, productgenius.guru, is and there's lots of people at medium and enterprise, but I said, what if we could build like a tool set that you could use to embed? Because you think about like Slack channels. It's a great, how much unstructured data is there. You think about all the historical product tooling. How many times does product get feature requests and then they put it here and they put it there? A human being can't look at all of that unstructured data to put patterns. So now you're seeing people put AI and focusing it. You're seeing that in tools. So now you can take all of this noise of sales feedback, customer feedback, and kind of uncover what are the true patterns. And then once you release it, you can also now monitor what's that experience. Whereas the delay factor is, like sometimes you release something and, 4 months later or 2 months later, you really get a good idea of, is this working or is not. I think now, because you can put something in your end user application where someone can ask a question, well, that's really valuable. If you released a new feature and customers are asking a lot of questions about that new feature, that tells you that feature's not designed well. There's some sort of issue, but you might not have known that. Whereas now, if you incorporate all those interaction points of your customers, you get those clear insights.
Yeah, I think that's a great call out. Where do you see this going into the future? So obviously AI is a very hot topic, especially over the last few years. How do you see that changing as we go forward, both the things that we're doing as product people, as businesses, but also for customers as well?
Well, I had a couple of ones. So it's about engineering. So engineering, they don't need to reinvent the wheel. Like my background, I did development, I did product. A lot of times it's like, oh, that's a hard problem. That problem's, I was asked, has somebody else solved this problem? Well, now that's more clear than ever. So what I'm seeing when I work with private equity companies and we basically get the engineering to go full on AI, we literally get, for every 3 developers, we effectively get another full developer philosophy. So that means that you're going to go faster with less people, or the same amount of people. Maybe you're going to hire less. So I think that's something that you're going to see on the engineering side. On the product side, I think you're going to be able to have better data as you start to instrument what the sales team, and, like, for example, think about all of if you're enterprise sales, they have extensive data of why they won or didn't lose deals. Sometimes that's buried in a PowerPoint or some other tool. Well, smart companies are taking that and say, let me take AI and grab all of the sales after action deals we won, didn't won, why did we, from a sales perspective. Let me go grab the customer feedback. Maybe had people out in the field, there's field reports, which a lot of times are just documents sitting there. Let me take all of those pieces in. Now let me take all that unstructured data, break it in if I've got general managers or products, and then that should be really impactful data for that quarterly planning process. So I think product managers are really in the goal of assimilating all of that data, working with other people to make sure they have it, then looking at it, and then taking a look and making sure that what they're building is the thing that's going to deliver the next best value, not that thing that annoys them, right? Or that should be this way. Because again, sometimes parts of your application are KTLO, keep the lights on. And that sucks as a product manager, especially if that's your product. You're like, oh, I don't want that, right? But you got to think about it. We're in it to actually make our business successful. That's why we get paid, right? To solve problems and use resources in the best ways. And so I think you're going to see a lot more data driven. which is going to make it a lot more efficient. And then I'll answer your last question, is even going back to mom and pop. So like with Product Genius, it does a lot of different things. You can embed it in website and applications and all that stuff. But we also made it so you could do a QR code. So we have literally retail stores that put QR codes, and now the customer can scan the QR code while in their store. They can give feedback. They can ask a question. If it's on the website, it can literally have a full conversation, answer any single question. And what's interesting is not just, what do the questions tell you? Because again, it builds patterns. So literally people that have bought the product, they run like one guy has 9 Marcos. And what it tells them is who his best employees are, who are his worst employees every single week. It tells them like, hey, you've got a staffing problem on Wednesdays at this location, because the data tells you. And so I think you're going to see efficiency, which ultimately means a better consumer experience. So I think people are going to have less time pushing buttons. Think about you check into a hotel. There's going to be less pushing buttons and more having a conversation with you, because the pushing buttons can be automated. And that wasn't a good use of human time anyway. Like I always think about, like, to me, I mean, I think there's going to be some repetitive jobs that are going to cease to exist. But I think AI ultimately takes away the work that really wasn't a good investment of a human's time, because AI can't do original thoughts, at least currently. None of the AI can do original thoughts. Only humans can have original thought. And if we have better data, I think we're going to make better decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a great call out. I'm interested. You made a reference to your book that you wrote, Business Breakthrough 3.0. Tell us what was the impetus for writing that, and what have you seen since you wrote that?
Well, I would say the impetus is there's clear patterns. Like I've seen, Fortune 50 healthcare companies. I've seen banks. I've seen, I just had a tremendous experience. And I've seen a lot of people, a lot of times I would come in and advise, maybe I sold a tool that helps a transformational leader do something. And what they would most be interested in talking to me was not the technology, was what is the people process to drive change in their organization. And so I would spend a lot of time in that. So I thought, hey, you know what? I've seen so much. There really are clear patterns around success and failure, and design, around that people process part. And so I wanted to write a book, really just hopefully helping some people. Because, again, one of my good friends said, hey, I know transformation leaders. They're the guys that get fired. But I mean, you have to deal with you're moving a lot of cheese, right? And so, but it's how companies grow. So we try to make it like a lot of easy. If you could just do this, implement this, it'll work. And here's 6 different stories of why that approach works well for what you're trying to do.
That's great. I'm interested as well. What advice would you give to somebody who is either an aspiring entrepreneur or wants to get into, technology or product right now, based on your experience or based on what you're seeing?
Sure. And I also certify coach only because I like to help people. But what I would say is the first thing is take a lot of chances when you're young. Take the most chances. Go sign up to that risky startup or go try that crazy idea when you're young. Because some people are like, oh, I'll do that later. Your risk profile is going to totally change. You're going to have kids. You're going to have this. You're going to think about, I got a retirement. If you take a ton of risk, do it. So I would say take a lot of risk early, because then you can afford to take risk later. Like for me, I took a lot of risk early, which led to financial success, which then allowed me to choose what type of risk that's interesting to me in the work that I did later. So it gives you a lot of choices if you're successful. Even if you're not successful, you will learn more in a failed startup in 2 years than 10 years at a Fortune 500 company, because they're going to put you in the lane. And so you can always go that. So I say take risk, a lot of risk at a young age. You're going to learn more, which is going to make you more marketable ultimately wherever you go. So I would say that's the biggest part. And then there's no free lunch. A lot of people are like, oh, startup, because they hear the one guy who make, like, I have seen people who have lost their marriages. I have seen people who have lost their fortunes, and I've also seen people that have made billions, and I've been blessed too. But it ain't easy. And it's always going back to luck, skill, and timing. All 3 of those have to come better. And I'll show you just one quick story because I think it was interesting. I'm sure you've heard of benchmark capital, right? And so one time I was having lunch with Bill Gurley, who's the guy who invested in Uber and a bunch of stuff. And at this point, Zillow was a company floundering, couldn't figure out what its market. And I'm like, Benchmark's known being very, very smart. And I said, hey, I'm just curious, like, why did you guys invest in Zillow? And they said, oh, it's real simple, because we knew if we put a lot of money, with the Expedia team, because basically the whole Expedia team was the original foundation of Zillow. They'll pivot and figure. So the last part I would say is take chances early and pick your partners, the CEO, whoever it is. Look at the character. Make sure the character's aligned to who you are. Because there's people that just don't have the morals that I have, right? Sometimes my morals have cost me money, but I'm okay with that. Other people are flexible on morals, then great. Do whatever works for you. But I would say pick your partners, pick your coworkers, pick your boss very carefully.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely great advice. And I 100% agree. Well, Ken, this has been a great conversation. And I do have a couple of wrap up questions before we finish. But before we do that, where can people find out more about you, about the things that you're working on?
Sure. If you want to find out me, you can go to kengavranovic.com. So KenGavranovic.com. Maybe we'll put a link in the notes when we do the show. And then if you want to learn, the company I'm involved with right now is productgenius.guru. And I always tell people, like, I have people that ping me on LinkedIn or whatever. If I can help you, I'm very much into giving back. I've seen a lot of things. So feel free to reach out if there's something you think or a question or something you're going, feel free to reach out to me. I'm glad to help.
Great. Well, yeah, we will put those links in the show notes so you can find them there. And then to wrap up, we usually like to ask a couple questions that don't have to be business or product related, but they certainly can be. And the first one is, have you read or watched or listened to anything recently that you have found interesting?
Well, I'll tell you, it's kind of recently, but I'm on book 16. If you're a sci-fi fan, Craig Allenson had this book called Columbus Day. That's like that has this AI. Have you heard of it?
It's on my reading list right now. So I
Oh
have
man, you
most
got to
of the
do it. It's up
books.
to
Yep.
16 books. And this guy, like, he's one of those guys where he was writing books, had a real job, self-published on Amazon, turned into a huge hit. But I would say I've laughed so much, and it's funny because I meet like the CTO of Disney, and a lot of times like, hey, what audiobooks you like? That's so common. Like, and so if you heard, there's the AI is called Skippy, but it's hilarious. So I would say check it out. Columbus Day is the first book in that series. You'll laugh. It's fun. Unless you're like totally not a sci-fi person, you'll have a great time with.
Okay. That's a great call out. I think, I don't remember if it was like the first couple of books on my list and I've got them already. So I've heard the same thing and I need to get started on them. Maybe I'll
Yeah, and
do that.
R.C. Bray is one of the best narrators. So if you do it on Audible, it's amazing.
Awesome. Great. And then final question, do you have any products that you have been using and enjoying lately, either physical products or digital products?
Well, I would say I'd still keep getting amazed. Like I use ChatGPT, Claude, and Perplexity for different things. Is the amount of time where I can get to the information that I want. I've gained probably 30% productivity personally in the things that I've done. And also, I'll just share this. Like, I have a son that has learning disabilities, and the part where I go back to it, I think it's very interesting, is without me telling him, he came across ChatGPT, and he uses that to bounce any of his life decisions on. And he's made a bunch. I'm not saying it's all ChatGPT, but he's made much better life decisions. So I would say it's not only great for just personal productivity, but even if you want to, because if you think about it, it's the knowledge of almost all mankind. You know, AI doesn't build new ideas, but it's really good at looking at all the things that have been done and giving you some perspective. So I would say that's probably something, I think the AI tools, the generative AI tools, are pretty amazing.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I even very recently was making, it wasn't a life decision, but it was just a small like, hey, should I do this or this? And I just typed it
Pros and
in.
cons.
Yeah, I was like, here, give, and it gave me a very good response of like, here's the pros and cons. Here's what you should probably do if you want this type of outcome. And I was like, that's about what I was looking for. Cause I was actually really frustrated with something. And I was like, all right, I need a cool head to just help me sort through this. And that's what it did. So it was like one of those use cases that is not professional necessarily, but also just a very, like you said, the knowledge of everything kind of coming together and being like, okay, that is a good path to take.
Yeah, it's so random. Like I'm into anti-aging. Like, oh, let me focus, be the healthiest person. But like, so there's this thing that a lot of people are doing with hyperbaric chambers, and so I was like doing some research, and Joe Rogan just happened. I'm curious. He probably spent a ton of time researching it. So I just asked Perplexity. I said, which brand does Joe Rogan? And so it went and found whatever episode that he happened to mention the exact brand. I would have never been able to find that. I would have gone like through, 20 pages of Google. So I think being able to get pinpoint the exact piece of information or the pros and cons and have a disinterested party bounce those pros and cons, I think is really, really powerful.
Yeah. Yep, definitely agree. Well, Ken, again, this has been a great conversation. We've touched on so many things, and I feel like we could have dove into a number more as well, but appreciate all of your time and insight. I think this has been, again, an excellent conversation, both about product and business and AI.
Yeah, Kyle, thanks so much for having me on.
All right. And thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll talk again next time.
Take care.
Thanks again for listening. If you like the show, be sure to follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. You can follow the show on TikTok at prodigy.co and on Twitter at prodigyco. You can also follow me on both of those platforms at Kyle Larry Evans. If you want more product conversation, check out my newsletter Prodigy at prodigy.co. You can also follow me on Medium at Kyle Larry Evans, or check out my Medium publication, Prodigy. Of course, you can check out all these links in the show notes.